Today I have the incredible honor of interviewing who I consider the godfather of personal finance. His name is J.L. Collins. I'm so stoked for this interview. So to give you a little bit of his bio, J.L. Collins launched his eponymous blog, jlcollinsnh.com, linked in the description box below, in June 2011. He has been called the godfather of FI. FI meaning financial independence. In 2013, he created the annual Chautauqua Retreat and ran 17 of these highly acclaimed annual events through 2022. He is the author of The Simple Path to Wealth, one of my favorite personal finance books. Loved it so much. I continue to read it over and over again and pick up new nuggets. It has sold over 500,000 copies that have been published in Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Germany, Russia, Spain, Brazil, Malaysia, and in Arabic. It is under contract to be published in China, Romania, Marathi, Bulgaria, Dutch, Lithuania, Turkey, Israel, Vietnam, Poland, and Thailand. His second book, How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable, was released in October 2021. And here he comes back with his third book, Pathfinders, 100 Stories from Around the World from People Following the Simple Path, is due October 31st. By the time this recording is on my channel, it's available for you to purchase, which I will link in the description box below. But without further ado, let's get in the interview with J.L. Collins. Welcome back to the Debt Free Millennials channel. I'm your host, Justine, and here we talk about all ways to help millennials achieve financial confidence, crush debt that leads to more fun and fewer payments. And today's episode is really, really delightful. I have the pleasure of having J.L. Collins on the channel today to talk to us about all things financial independence, personal finance, and how it relates to our generation. So welcome to the show, JL.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So as you heard in his bio, JL is the author of The Simple Path to Wealth, which I have right here. I'm a big fan. It's been my money Bible for the last couple of years. In fact, I had bought it on Kindle, loved it so much that I said I need a hard copy to mark up and flag. So walk us through one of the concepts that you introduce in the book early on is this concept of FU money. So for those of us who haven't read the book, what is FU money and how does it help achieve financial independence?
Well, so I first heard the term FU money reading a novel by James Clavell called Noble House. And in that novel, there's a character, and she states that her financial objective is to have FU money. And this is when I was in my 20s and I was beginning to walk down this path, but I didn't have a name for it. And the moment I heard that term, it crystallized, yes, that's what I want. And in some ways, my definition is a little different than others. So I see FU money as the money you accumulate on the way to finally being financially independent. Financially independent being the point where you have enough money that the money your money earns is enough to pay all of your expenses. But every step along the way, you're accumulating money. That's your FU money that makes you fiscally stronger and allows you to make freer and bolder decisions.
So you started that journey when you were 25?
Right.
And then how long did it take for you to actually achieve that? Because I think when you mentioned in the book, you said it could just be enough money to give yourself a break.
Right. So if we're talking about FU money, I mean, I started out, my first professional job was in 1974, and I was making $10,000 a year. Now, you have to adjust for inflation to make that relative today, I guess. But at the time, that was pretty good money. And I realized that there were people living on $5,000 a year, and I'd been living on far less than $5,000 a year all through college. It took me 2 years out of college to get that professional job because in the 70s, it was a pretty nasty economic time with stagflation and all that stuff. So Anyway, living on $5,000 was no big challenge. And I wanted to have enough money to invest because I knew I wanted to have that FU money. And really, it only took a couple of years from that point to where I'd accumulated $5,000. And $5,000 in those days was enough to go to Europe for a year. So that was one of my ambitions, and it was in that negotiation with my employer. It was the first time I learned the power of having FU money.
So you mentioned the 70s, and my parents were born in the 60s, and so grew up in the 70s. So they are true baby boomers. Do you find that that generation has it better financially than millennials when they were in their 20s, 30s?
I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1950, so I guess I'm kind of at the early edge of it or right in the middle of it or whatever.
Yes.
And since I started writing the blog in 2011, I've gotten to know a lot of millennials. I have a millennial daughter who's 31.
I was
And
going to
what's
ask
strange,
how old she was.
yeah, she's 31 as of this last spring. And I'm actually struck by the similarities of the generation, and I think there's a lot of artificial nonsense that's put out. It was put out in my day and is put out now as to this kind of conflict. But all of the criticisms that I hear about millennials that supposedly baby boomers have, I have to say I don't really hear that amongst the baby boomers I know. But they were exactly the same things that we were told our parents' generation had about us. We don't work hard enough. We're lazy. We don't appreciate the value of a dollar. We don't know how good we had it, blah, blah, all that kind of nonsense.
Wow.
And I think the similarities are much more than the differences. I think, baby boomers who came out of college as I did in the 70s came out in a very tough economic time. A lot of millennials came out in a tough economic time. As I alluded to earlier, it took me 2 years to get my first professional job out of college. I think the one area where millennials do have it tougher is this whole student debt thing. Because when I was young, student debt was just not widely available. And because it was not widely available, college was a lot less expensive. I put myself through college, which is something you could do in those days because I could make enough money during the summer to pay for my college. I went to a state school, to be clear, and an in-state school, but nevertheless, that was a doable thing. And by the time my daughter went to college, that was not a doable thing. You could not work over the course of a summer and accumulate enough money. I think what's happened with college debt is criminal, that it's been made so easily available and foisted off on young people at a time where they really don't understand, for the most part. I know I certainly wouldn't have at 18, the enormous obligation that they're taking on. But other than that, I think the generations are actually remarkably similar. And I think, like the baby boomers, the millennials are well on their way to having a great run. I saw a report recently that millennials are actually further ahead financially for their age than we baby boomers were at the time. And that bodes well because we baby boomers so far are the wealthiest generation, and it looks like you millennials are going to outstrip us, and that's kind of the way it should be. I'm certainly expecting
fingers
my
crossed.
daughter. Yeah, fingers crossed. Exactly. And it's going to take a lot of hard work, and it's not going to apply to everybody. But my daughter's certainly on that path. I'm going to guess, Justine, that you're on that path, and probably your listeners are.
Yes. So it's so interesting hearing you say that the generation prior to baby boomers, the silent generation, your parents telling you the same thing that baby boomers are telling millennials is kind of just this waterfall effect. And
maybe that's what we learned.
Knowing the story. Right. And I go back to some of the things that my parents told me when they were just getting started out in their young adult lives. And at that time, they were living in the Bay Area in California. And my mom can tell me the first
house they purchased actually had a 12% interest rate, which is
Mm,
insane to me. And California had a first time home buyers grant that they were eligible for that helped keep that payment down. And speaking of payments in home ownership, because now we've seen the interest rates go creep up to 8% now, and the housing market has just been insane since the pandemic.
right.
Do you think home ownership is still a viable option for millennials? Sometimes I feel like giving up.
Well, so first of all, I have your parents beat in the sense that the second piece of real estate I ever bought, which would have been in 1979, it was in Chicago, what we called a two flat, so a two family house. My mortgage from the bank was 18%.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I borrowed two-thirds of the price from the bank, and then I borrowed the other third from the owner. So I took owner financing, and he charged, I think we negotiated 7 or 8%. So the net combination of those came to about 13%, which was a screaming deal in those days. So I was delighted to have gotten it. But is homeownership still viable? Sure, it's still viable. One of the challenges you guys have is that, like, schools have gotten a lot fancier because you can borrow money to go. Houses have gotten a lot fancier than they were back in the day, so it's kind of
Mm.
hard to find a basic house. The most infamous post on my blog is one that I kind of did as a lark, kind of quickly, but it's titled "Why Your House is a Terrible Investment." I don't think aspiring to owning a house is necessarily the right thing to do. I don't think houses should be
Yes.
considered investments. I think houses are expensive indulgences. Now, to be clear, I have nothing against expensive indulgences. I've owned houses most of my adult life, but I've never thought of them as an investment. And I've never bought the most house that the bankers or the real estate people told me I could afford. I always bought the least house that met my needs. And I think I call that buying, and this applies to buying anything, of course, buying from a position of strength. So I wouldn't worry about buying a house. My daughter is not the least bit interested in owning a house. You know, she's very mobile. She has a job where she can work remotely. I think a year ago, she moved from Denver to Savannah, Georgia, and who knows
Oh,
how
how
long she'll
fun.
be there. But she's not tied down to a house. And at some point,
Mm.
when it's time to buy one, and of course she's on the path to accumulating her own FU money and ultimately financial independence, she'll be able to easily afford it. So that's the way I think about housing.
So, my husband and I have been lifelong renters, and it's afforded us the ability to live in some really amazing cities. We moved from small town Kansas to downtown San Diego, and we were there for 7 years. And then more recently, we've been renting up in Los Angeles. However, the rent in Southern California is super high. We have a 2-year-old daughter. We've talked about having a second baby, and it just makes sense for us to move to a cheaper cost of living area. Are you finding these types of stories out there as well from millennials?
In fact, in my new book, Pathfinders, there's a story about, um, I think they're millennials, but they're tech workers or were tech workers in the Bay Area, and were making good money, and they did a little bit of geo arbitrage and moving back to Ohio, where they were from, where their money went a lot further. So yeah, those are very common stories, and it's a great strategy. And of course, one of the advantages that your generation has, and my daughter's taking advantage of at the moment, is that at least with some of these jobs, you're location independent. You're not required to go into an office, so you can work in an area which is paying very well and live in a low cost of living area. And I think your decision to rent, because as expensive as renting is in California, homeownership, from what I understand, is even worse. So you
Yes,
get
it is.
Yeah, so you kind of get to experience the lifestyle at a bargain rate. And one of the things, by the way, while we're talking about homes, that people tend to forget is I'll hear people too commonly say, "Well, I can get a mortgage for the amount that I'm paying in rent." And that may be true, but your mortgage is only one part of owning a house.
Mm.
If when you're renting, you're never going to be tempted to renovate the kitchen. You're never going to be putting in expensive landscaping. They're when you own a house, one of the reasons the economy to a large extent is driven by home ownership is because homeowners spend a lot of money on furniture, on appliances, on services, on repairs, on remodeling and what have you, that people tend not to think about as much as perhaps they should.
Are you are a homeowner? Yes.
I am, and as I said a bit ago, for most, not all, but for most of my adult life, I've owned homes. Now, I regret the early ones because when I was walking this path, I was wandering in the wilderness. So I actually have a book out called "How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable" that talks about the first piece of real estate I bought, and I want to say I was probably 28 or 29 when I bought it. It was a condo in Chicago. It turned out to be an unmitigated, expensive disaster. Great education, but a very expensive education. I obviously wish I hadn't bought that one. The two flat that I mentioned earlier came after that. I wound up owning them both for a while, and that worked out a lot better. But I still wish I hadn't bought it because I would have done better investing my money outside of it. I wish I'd continued to rent at that point. In fact,
Mm.
it probably wasn't until 1986 when we bought the house in Ohio, which we didn't really need, but it was an old house that had a lot of charm and we could easily afford it, the whole expensive indulgence thing. So that would have been when I was about 36. That's probably the first house that first thing I don't regret buying.
Okay. So you were in your mid 30s when you said this financial decision makes sense to own this home.
Well, to be clear, at the time, I thought the other ones, the earlier ones, made sense too, because I didn't have the knowledge base, right? I didn't know then what I know now. But looking back on
Yes.
it, with
Looking back.
the advantage of hindsight, I can see the mistakes, and like a lot of people, I was just sucked into the common wisdom that, oh, of course you should own. Of course,
Mm.
renting is throwing money away, and that's absolute nonsense. So it's
Mm.
the advantage of 2020 hindsight.
I love
I
that
like.
because
Yeah, go ahead.
imagine me as that younger version of yourself because I'm in my mid 30s and I get that pressure. I get that pressure to
Oh,
say, well, you're throwing money away. You should be in a house by now. You have a family and this is really refreshing to hear.
yeah, you should buy a house when it suits your needs and you can easily afford it, and it's an indulgence you want.
Indulgence that you want. I love that. Speaking of these life milestones, I find when I'm speaking with my one on one financial coaching clients that it is, you mentioned the student loan debt, which, yes, absolutely agree with you. The inflation in tuition alone is just sickening. And what I'm finding is credit card debt tends to be creeping up in our generation and is preventing us from hitting these bigger financial milestones. And so talk to me about what you find with those who have credit card debt. What are the real reasons people get stuck in that cycle of high interest debt?
Yeah, so credit card debt is something that millennials and boomers have in common, at least when we were the same age as you guys. It's just very seductive, and we live in a consumerist culture, and we are bombarded all the time with messages. This is not a great conspiracy. This is just companies trying hard to sell their products, but we're always being told you deserve a break today. And, if you drive this kind of car, the people around you will admire you, or they'll pay more attention to you, or you'll have more status, or you need to have this bigger, fancier house, and all of this kind of nonsense. And what people don't hear is that there is something else you can spend your money on, and that is buying your financial freedom, buying your time. I mean, that's what I chose to spend my money on. So to me, and I've never been in debt. I've never even had a car loan. So to me, debt is so appalling that it's kind of hard for me to understand how so many people just accept it as the way things are, that it's normal, that it should be. And it's like being covered with blood-sucking leeches and saying this is okay. It's exactly the same kind of thing, and it's not okay. You are never going to be financially independent if you carry consumer debt. And my advice is you just need to take out your sharpest knife and start scraping the little bloodsuckers off. I saw, by the way, in preparing for this, that you had a video about Dave Ramsey, and my approach to debt is a little different than his. He says that you should pay off the smaller debts first for the psychological satisfaction. And okay, maybe if you need that to keep yourself motivated, but I'm a numbers guy. And so my advice is to make a list of all your debts and pick the one with the biggest interest rate and start paying that one off, because that's where your biggest immediate return is, and then work your way down the list. But there's no magic formula for this. This is just something that you have to grind through. So you don't want to fall prey to these predators that are out there trying to convince you, oh, they have some symptoms. That's only going to cost you more money. You just have to stop spending all your money and start diverting a good sized chunk of it to paying those debts down. Again, I would go with the highest interest rates first. The silver lining in this, by the way, is if once you develop that discipline of arranging your life so you have that money to throw to your debt, once the debts are gone, you can just start throwing that money towards your investments and buying your freedom, and just carry that on. And then you can watch, just as you watched your debt disappear, you can watch your wealth begin to grow.
Okay, you're kind of already going through the steps that you mentioned in the Simple Path to Wealth. Can you walk us through what are those steps to achieving financial independence? If I'm a millennial who has student loans, credit card debt, but I want to invest, what is the first step?
Well, I think the basic formula is avoid debt or get out of it if you have it. Live on less than you earn, which is critical because you have to free up the money to either pay off the debt or to begin buying your freedom, and you buy your freedom with investments. And then the third thing is to invest the surplus. And of course, a lot of the Simple Path to Wealth, as having read it, I'm sure you know, talks about exactly what that investment path ought to look like, where you ought to make those investments, and why you ought to invest in the things that I suggest.
That is a page that I have flagged that I constantly refer back to, starting with the 401k and going up to the employer match, fully funding the Roth if you're eligible, and then doing a deductible IRA, then keeping the Roth, letting it grow, finish funding and maxing out your 401k up to the limit, contribution limit, and then considering a non-deductible IRA, and then lastly, doing a taxable account, such as a taxable brokerage. Are these the steps that you're still recommending today?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's, I wandered in the wilderness for decades figuring this out because, when I started in 1975, which was when I began investing, there was no internet. I mean, there weren't personal computers for that matter, right? So there was not the easy flow of information that's available today. But once I got it sorted out, the Simple Path to Wealth, what you hold in your hand, is exactly what I tell my daughter. And I mean, I wrote the book for my daughter because she wouldn't listen to me when she was young. In fact, she likes to tease me now. She says, Dad, if I'd listened to you when I was young, there'd be no blog, there'd be no Chautauqua events, there'd be no books. Justine wouldn't want to interview you on her YouTube channel. None of this would exist. So I owe it all to the little girl who wouldn't listen.
Oh, that's so kind. And speaking of your daughter, I know you can't speak for her experiences that she's faced, and as her father, have you seen her encounter financial challenges that were perhaps different than what you experienced at her age?
Well, so interestingly, at the end of Pathfinders, which is the new book, Christine Benz from Morningstar interviews my daughter Jessica and myself. It's the last chapter in the book, and we talk about her experience of growing up with me as her father and what her journey has looked like. So I think that's a little in depth, and you can hear what she has to say in her own words, or read what she has to say in her own words, depending on whether you're reading it or an audible version. But I think overall, her path has been a lot smoother than mine because she didn't have to wander in the wilderness the way I did. She had a path available to her, and when she was finally willing to listen and pay attention to it and read about it, it made sense to her. It resonated with her. So I would say financially, her path has been a whole lot smoother. And of course, as her father, I think all parents who love their children want their children to have an easier time of it and a smoother path. So, not to say that it doesn't have its own bumps in the road, because everybody's does, but I think I think it's been smoother overall. I think she'd agree with that.
I cannot wait to read that section. And speaking of that section of the book, Pathfinders, which is your brand new book releasing, tell us a little bit about Pathfinders and what it's about.
So I published The Simple Path to Wealth in 2016. And as we talked about a moment ago, it's really written for my daughter. And she was in college at the time, so at the beginning of her journey, and she's an American. So The Simple Path to Wealth is a U.S.-centric book that kind of makes the assumption that you're just beginning on your path. Well, most of the readers don't fit that exact profile. And almost from the moment the book came out, I started hearing these amazing stories from people about how they were implementing the lessons in The Simple Path to Wealth, sometimes living in entirely different countries that didn't have the 401ks and IRAs and everything you were talking about a moment ago. Frequently people who were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, who had created a lifestyle that they needed to unwind before they could get on the path because they didn't let it inflate. In fact, there's a whole section in the book about lifestyle inflation. People who wrestled with debt, which I've managed to persuade my daughter to avoid. It's just kind of stunning to me. And I've loved those stories. People who started from really challenging beginnings. One of the things that's always kind of bothered me is, since I've been writing for this community in 2011, starting in 2011, was the pushback that, oh, this all sounds great, but it's only for wealthy people, who are making big salaries. Well, I've said to people, if you read the stories, and there are about 100 of them in Pathfinders, you will never again be able to say you can't do it, because I guarantee there are people doing it who have more challenges than you. Now, you can still, of course, say, I choose not to do it, but you won't be able to say it can't be done. And you will at least know that it is an option, that you can divert some of your money to buy your freedom. So, we put out the call, we being my editor, Chris, and myself, and gathered these stories, selected 100 of the best of them, as we went through them, they kind of sorted themselves out into the 9 sections that make up the book. And I write an introduction and overview of each of the 9 sections, like lifestyle, inflation, debt being a couple of examples. And then it's followed with the stories. Some of them are only a couple of paragraphs, and some of them are a few pages. And I find them endlessly fascinating. And so far, the people who've read the book have seemed to agree.
That is wonderful. I cannot wait to get my hands on it. Can you tell us where we can find the book so we can pick up a copy?
Yeah, so it should be pretty easy to find. My first 2 books I self-published, and so they were exclusively through Amazon. And Pathfinders will certainly be available on Amazon, but Harriman House is the publisher for this, and they have a pretty extensive distribution network. So unlike Simple Path to Wealth, Pathfinders might show up in an airport kiosk as you're walking through, or in your local bookstore and stuff like that. So I'm pretty excited about the kind of reach that's out there. And, the other thing is I've been asked, do I need to read The Simple Path to Wealth first? And the answer to that is no. I think you can read, doesn't really matter. But if you haven't read either of them, I'd almost say start with Pathfinders, because Pathfinders tells you the stories of the people who are doing this and how well it's worked for them. And then The Simple Path to Wealth is kind of the instruction manual of just exactly how to implement this path if you choose to do it.
So go get inspired, read Pathfinders, and then if you want the how-to, pick up The Simple Path to Wealth, which I continue to use as my money Bible for financial independence and achieving my own FU money. It has been so lovely speaking with you today. If people are interested in following you or just want to get more updates from you, where should they go?
So probably the best place to start is the blog, which is JL Collins NH, which stands for New Hampshire, where I lived at the time, .com. So jlcollinsnh.com. Not very creative a name, but at least you'll know it's mine.
And I will be sure to include a link in the description box below, both to the blog and to Pathfinders and to The Simple Path to Wealth. So you'll see 3 different links where you can purchase the books, follow JL on his blog. And again, this was such an amazing conversation. Very honored that you are on the channel with us today. Thank you so much.
Justine, it was entirely my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It was fun.
I had such a great time interviewing JL. It truly was like I was fangirling out the entire time. I could not believe I was actually live with him recording. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to check out those book links and the link to JL's blog in the description box. Make sure that you're subscribed. If you're a new subscriber, welcome to the fam. Click that red subscribe button so you never miss another video from me, and we'll catch you in the next one.